Madam Deputy Speaker, in developing this legislation, we have worked very closely with the National Farmers Union.
Our food has a great reputation. As we leave the European Union, we will have the opportunity to deliver a farming policy which works for the whole industry, and that's why we're asking for the views of everyone involved.
This is your opportunity to shape the future. I urge you to have your say, make farming's voice heard.
The time is always right to open up your eyes and be the flickering flame.
It's a timely reminder that you should never take food production for granted.
Cracks and dust. This dairy farm in North Pembrokeshire looks more like something out of the Midwest.
This is unprecedented for me. We are getting seriously short of grass now.
We've been asking for this since 2011. Growers, of course, across the country would like to see higher numbers.
Every single one of us should try and do at least one thing this week.
So for me, I'm going to be doubly checking all my PTO cards.
We've brought Red Tractor, we've brought farming to the heart of the capital.
We found that NFU Energy has been a good link to actually see what's happening within the industry.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our political session. My name's John Davis and I'm NFU Cymru President, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I'm a beef and sheep farmer from the Epint, and it's absolutely great that each and every one of you have taken time to come to this, our political session. Because politics can be a bit boring, it can be a bit incessant at the present time, but it's absolutely vital that you're properly informed and that you know when you speak, you have the right facts at your fingertips. We've got a fantastic team here today, which I'll go on to introduce later. Brexit has inevitably dominated our debate so far this week. We make no apologies for that because it will affect each and every one of your businesses for the next generation. And of course, part of that leadership role as an organisation that we've taken has been to strengthen our team. We've recruited a new EU and international trade team to deal with the challenges and opportunities that Brexit brings. And it's my pleasure now to introduce to you this morning Nick van Westenholz. He's our Director of EU Exit and International Trade. Gail Souter, Chief EU Exit and International Trade Advisor. And of course, Andrew Clark, our Director of Policy. The aim of the session this morning is to understand the key issues. So without further ado, we'll have Nick to open. And before Nick starts, ladies and gentlemen, I am warning you that I'm looking for spontaneous questions here today. We have no questions planned, so I really need you to think of some good questions. Each of our speakers is going to speak for a couple of minutes, and then we'll take questions after. And we hope to have around 20 minutes or so for questions. So, Nick, for the benefit of those here today who are not following the Brexit process in the detail or depth that you and the team in London are, can you set out for us the main political landscape in Westminster and the key aspects you see having an impact on farming in the weeks to come?
Yeah, thanks, John. I always get the easy question in these sessions, what's going to happen with Brexit? And I've sort of failed to answer that for many months now, and I'll continue to fail to do so because, of course, there's a huge amount of uncertainty and frankly confusion which we have to put up with. Luckily for me, you are very fortunate to have Steve Richards coming on stage in 45 minutes or so, who will explain things and throw some light on the politics. But what I can do is just try and set out a little bit from the NFU's point of view what the political landscape looks like, and in particular what it looks like over the next few weeks leading up until the end of March. I think the really important thing I'd try and stress with members in particular is whatever the conversations, whatever the debate and discussions going on around Brexit, there remain three key possible outcomes, only three. There's either no Brexit at all, or there is Brexit with a deal, leaving with a deal, or there is Brexit leaving without a deal, a disorderly Brexit. All of the discussion around second referendums, general elections, postponements, extensions of Article 50, those are merely mechanisms on the way, staging posts essentially, to one of those three outcomes. And it's important to, I think, bear that in mind while we're trying to consider what the NFU's response and approach is to these debates and discussions. And while that's the case, then a deal, an agreed deal between the EU and the UK remains the primary way of avoiding no deal. And there is, of course, still a deal, more or less, on the table. There are debates and discussions, and indeed the Prime Minister is going to Brussels today to discuss what amendments might be made to her withdrawal agreement. But nevertheless, we still sort of need to work on the basis of what she came up with at the end of November, beginning of December. And there are two elements to that. We've got a withdrawal agreement dealing with the main divorce procedures, I guess, the money we owe, citizens' rights, and of course the very, very thorny issue of the Northern Ireland backstop. And then there's the political declaration on the future relationship. Now, the withdrawal agreement was nearly 600 pages of binding legal text. And of course, there's a big argument about whether that can be reopened and amended at all. But the political declaration was less than 30 pages of, frankly, pretty vague aspirations about what the future relationship between the UK and the EU will look like. And that's non-binding. That's probably more open to amendment. But it's something which often gets overlooked, that is still very open. And that is what is going to, should the withdrawal agreement get through, take up all of our time and indeed the country's time over the next 2 or 3 years as it actually hammers out the details of that. So when we're talking about possibilities of a Norway-type arrangement or a Canada-type arrangement, it's really all contained in that future relationship piece, not in the legally binding withdrawal agreement, which is causing such consternation at the moment. I won't go into the details, and Steve may cover this a bit. I won't go into the details of the Northern Ireland backstop and the arguments over that. Suffice to say that it clearly is the main sticking point and possibly holds the key to breaking through the impasse at the moment. Whether that can happen is the question, and if it doesn't, then we may well still face a no-deal exit at the end of March. But Now, I've said this before, so I've got to be quite careful, but next week could be a critical week in the Brexit process. That we've had a few critical weeks, but it could be. There is another round of potentially binding votes a week today, next Wednesday, and that includes a very interesting amendment put forward by the Labour MP Yvette Cooper and Conservative Oliver Letwin, which essentially will force the government to show its hand as to whether it wants a no deal or whether it must extend Article 50, and it'll have to choose one or the other. So if that gets support next week, there'd still then have to be a bill after that, but if that gets support, that really could be a very significant development, and essentially would take some control away from the Prime Minister to Parliament. So next week is important, and that's why there is a sudden sort of a little bit of expectation that maybe the Prime Minister will try and bring something back ahead of that moment and have another meaningful vote in Parliament. So we will see. I'm sure there's lots of other issues, other questions, but we are sort of limited for time, so I won't go on for too much longer. But I did just want to mention that this Article 50 process and no deal preparations, which Gail will talk about, really are taking up an awful lot of our time. And frankly, Minette's comments yesterday about all the other things we could have been doing usefully over the last couple of years are absolutely right and are being really exacerbated in the current environment. But there are other things we need to keep our minds on, purely Brexit related. The agriculture bill is still in Parliament and House of Commons. That is paused, but we still need to lobby heavily on that. Obviously a crucial piece of legislation. The trade bill, carrying over our existing trade deals, is paused in the House of Lords, sitting there. We've got an immigration white paper, which is being consulted on at the moment. Indeed, Home Office officials are here today talking to NFU members and staff about that. And we also face this enormous challenge right now and continuing over the next few weeks of transferring the entire body of EU law into UK law through a system of statutory instruments, secondary legislation in Parliament. Again, and it's just an enormously time-consuming but important process. So a lot going on, keeping us very busy, which is important. But as I say, it's a very intensive few weeks ahead, and Steve's going to tell us exactly how it's all going to work out.
Thank you for that, Nick. And of course, the ball is getting kicked down the road. Just soon, I guess, the road will run out, but, that can't keep getting done forever. Obviously, Gail, it's absolutely vital. We've had the political landscape from Nick there, but it's how we trade and the opportunities to trade and what restrictions possibly could be on them. Can you outline some of the opportunities and some of the challenges possibly that could be in place with that in terms of trading and a commercial operation?
Yeah, absolutely, John. I think Nick has mentioned that there is a great deal of uncertainty, and that's absolutely right. But one thing is clear in that if there is a deal, then actually we will continue to have free and frictionless trade with the European Union right through until the end of December 2020 and possibly beyond that as well. And during that period, the UK will be able to go forth around the world and start to negotiate new free trade agreements. DIT has run consultations looking to open up negotiations with Australia, New Zealand, the USA, some of the Pacific countries. So under a deal situation, we are going to be in a situation where we're going to start to look at what the opportunities are to opening up new markets around the world. The other thing to point out in terms of a deal situation is that over the last 40 years of being a member of the European Union, it has negotiated around 40 free trade agreements from which we can benefit into about 70 different countries. And again, in a deal situation, we will continue to be able to access those markets. I think as Nick pointed out, one of the massive tasks for us as an NFU in the coming few years, if there is a deal, will be to negotiate that biggest single free trade agreement with the European Union. That will be our absolute focus in terms of, opening up markets, ensuring that we have access into new markets. Well, we have to make sure that we continue to have that free and frictionless access into the European market. That's really important for us. So that's what we know. That's the more certain deal situation. And if we look now into the no deal situation, essentially a disorderly exit from the EU. It's much more challenging for British farming. I like to break down international trade into two aspects, basically imports and exports. If we start with the export situation, we export around £13 billion worth of product to the European Union each year. It's going tariff-free, it's frictionless, sent to the European Union. But in a no-deal situation, that will be under threat. For some sectors, take the lamb sector in particular, we export around 30% of our production to the vast majority, over 90% of that, to the European Union. And the first challenge that we will face is around whether or not we will have the right approved status, whether or not we will actually legally be able to export to the European Union. And as things stand at the moment, when it comes to lamb, pork, poultry, dairy, all of the animal products, we don't have that approved third country status. Now, we hope we'll get it. We're very optimistic. We are, as obviously at the moment, members of the European Union, following all the rules and regulations. There's no reason why we shouldn't get it, but this is within the gift of the European Commission to grant it to us. So we're working through our Brussels office to make sure that, step one, we have the right approvals in place to be able to export to the European Union. Step two, the next challenge around exports is that once we can trade onto that market, can we do competitively? So the European Union has made it clear that in a no-deal situation, our exports would face the full external tariff that the EU applies to third countries, and that is significant. Products like beef, for example, would have a tariff on average of 65% slapped onto the value of the export, lamb 46%, fresh milk 75%. So the figures are quite staggering in terms of the scale of the tariff that we would have to incur to be able to trade onto that market. So there are a lot of challenges in terms of no deal. The other concerning aspect of a no-deal situation is that those free trade agreements I mentioned at the beginning that the EU has negotiated on our behalf, actually there's no guarantee that we will be able to continue to benefit or be able to access those markets. So we know of those 40 different agreements that we've done with countries around the world, around 6 of them have actually said, yes, by the 29th of March, we will have the right provisions in place to continue trading on the current basis. But there's some really significant markets that we currently are able to access by virtue of our membership of the European Union, Canada, Turkey, South Africa. These are all important markets for us in terms of high quality product or maybe even fifth quarter type products that we just simply don't know whether or not we'll be able to trade on the current basis. So there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of exports, but I think most of us yesterday were listening to Michael Gove when he mentioned what the situation may be with respect to imports coming in, and that's the other side of the coin when it comes to international trade. We still don't know, even though we think it's probably imminent, we still don't know what will be the government's applied tariff policy. How will it treat imports coming into our country? We know some things like the concessions that have been negotiated as part of our World Trade Organization membership. So, for example, the New Zealand lamb quota, that's going to continue in place. All of the preferences that we've given to, say, developing countries, that's going to continue in place as well. But we import around 30% of the food that we consume in this country from the European Union, and it's not yet clear how the government will treat those imports. We know the government is very determined to try and maintain consumer prices, and so one thing that they will look at is whether or not to potentially reduce tariffs to those imports coming in. And the threat that we face there is that given we don't have an agreement with the European Union in a situation, we're not leaving with a deal with the European Union, we cannot simply say, well, let's just give the European Union this preferential access, let's just give it to the EU. Under World Trade Organization rules, we would have to give that duty-free access to the whole of the world. And that is concerning. We've had assurances that our standards will not be undermined, which is reassuring. But from a price competitiveness perspective, we could see quite a lot more competition on our domestic market, and that could have a depressing impact on farm gate prices. So in all, a no-deal situation is very challenging for the farming sector. as Nick mentioned, there's a lot of activity trying to go in to prepare for that, to mitigate the worst effects of that. And one thing that I would draw your attention to, if I may, is that we've produced within the NFU a Brexit toolbox, which sets out many of the points that I've raised there in terms of international trade, but it also sets out the situation in regards to labour, domestic agricultural policy, the regulations, the rules of the land. So this toolbox is available on the registration desk, and hopefully people will be able to pick up a copy before they go home today.
Thank you for that, Gail. Really important that we have those facts and figures at our fingertips, and it's going to be an absolutely crucial few weeks ahead of us. Andrew, obviously we've heard from the Brexit perspective, but the day job continues. Can you tell us what are the policy priorities now for 2019 in your role?
Okay, thank you, John. And I think it's really important, before I just go on to the priorities I'm thinking about, is that you and I are very aware as directors and office holders just the range of policy work that we do. And there is a lot of work going on outside the Brexit team. We're really lucky that we've got a Brussels office where we work with other UK farming unions. We've got the Stony team looking across the commodities, which you've all heard about this morning, cross-cutting issues as well in terms of policy services. You've got your Welsh team as well in terms of policy work there and the coordination we do there. And then, of course, including the policy directorate as well, working with our regions, we've got our BTB, wildlife support coal team. So, I mean, we're really fortunate in the organisation to have a really committed team working across all of those places. And increasingly, you introduced the session talking about the politics. Increasingly, it's not just about what the NFU does, it's what the NFU can do with others, working in partnership. So, you know, the obviously one we've just mentioned is Brussels office, and there we are, UK farming unions speaking with one voice about what we want from the European Union, and increasingly working in bilateral relationships with other EU farming unions. We've also helped to convene the UK Farming Roundtable under Manette's chairmanship. And I think that partnership is a characteristic of the type of work we need to do in the future in terms of making our voice clear to politicians and decision makers. I think when I'm moving on to the priorities, I look at it in three ways. Now, we've already talked about making the best of Brexit, and that's something which runs away throughout the organisation. While we've got Nick and Gail leading on that, many of the team across the 90 and the policy director are contributing to that, and at regional level as well. We've got the day job, which I want to mention in a moment too, and then setting the agenda as well, because it's really important that we in the NFU, on your behalf, are looking over the horizon. What are the things coming our way, and that we need to prepare for? So thinking about day job, really interesting to hear about what Mark Ago was talking about BPS and countryside stewardship. We might want to come back to that in a moment or two. Doing things like rural crime. Minette's mentioned this already. Important that we make sure that the issues of fly tipping, fly grazing, hare coursing are actually felt. They matter day in, day out on farm businesses, and we can't ignore them. How cross-compliance, for example, is applied. Last summer's drought. There's a whole lot of issues there which are coming at us day in, day out, just like they are to members. And we've got to be there representing our members in those situations. Thinking about setting the agenda in terms of Brexit, you'll be aware of the work we've already done in terms of establishing what we'd like to see from the next agricultural policy in terms of our Brexit cornerstones. We're starting to work now on looking at within each of those cornerstones, what does the next agri-environment scheme look like? What are our expectations of that? What type of productivity schemes do we want to see? Starting to develop that. We're talking about net zero agriculture, looking ahead to 2040. That is really setting the agenda, but it's also bringing others to the NFU to ask how can they help deliver on that type of ambition. So moving on to 2019, just to close off on this, 2019, I think one thing I really encourage you to come forward from the audience saying what you think our priorities should be. This is a great opportunity for policy consultation, and we don't often get much opportunity to hear that. So for me, the two major cornerstones, sort of bookends here, is the work we're doing to influence DEFRA's food strategy. We need to make sure that food is a critical part of agricultural policy and government policy in the future, influencing public procurement as well as the type of measures we have that improve farming businesses in the future. We want to push a lot more in terms of champion what we do on the farmed environment. We think there are great things that farmers are already doing, but there are many things that we could do better. Let's have a discussion about both what we do to sustain the environment, but also what we could do better. I'm concerned on the background, reflecting on the last year in terms of neonics, metaldehyde, glyphosate. We need to look at plant protection and have a much more comprehensive plant protection strategy, which covers the bases. It's aiming for profitable, productive, healthy plants. And how do we get that? Through a whole range of interventions. And then long term, I'm interested in the politics of our long-term relationship between the EU and the UK. We're looking at that already in terms of the Brussels office, what type of representation we have there, what sort of links. But each one of these things rely not just on the policy team, not just on office holders, they rely on everybody playing a part. So it's across the whole of the NFU. We work as one NFU in the policy team, working with external affairs, working with communication colleagues, working with regions. All of them help us deliver the policy that you need in the future. But most importantly, we do it alongside members, because the NFU is never stronger than it is members and staff working together. It's an absolutely unique type of representation that we have that very few other organisations have. And that's something that's going to be absolutely heart of our political representation in the future.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. Right, I'm really keen now that we have as many questions as possible from the audience, and these are going to be spontaneous questions. The way it'll work, we've got 2 microphones down the front, we've got 2 in the middle, and we've got 2 up on the balcony. So if you all form an orderly queue next to one of those microphones, if we could have the first question, please. Is anybody ready to roll? Somebody walking back to one there? Mid-right. Yep.
Yeah, I'm the other way around to you, John. I thought it was on the left.
All right, well.
In dairy, we've seen in the past that we've got market management tools such as intervention to try and control the market. Over the last 10 years or so, we've benefited from BPS, which helps us manage volatility as farmers. What should we expect from government to help us become more resilient in the face of extreme weather, in terms of potential market failure, to try and support us to make us more resilient, or am I living in dreamland?
No, absolutely not. And I think it's absolutely vital that we get the future farm policy right. And productivity, I'm going to Andrew here on the productivity and the opportunities that the new farm policy could offer around that.
I think, Rob, you make a really important point there. I'll go and ask Gail or Nick to talk a little bit about the transition from where we are in 2021 through to 2027. There is a transition there, so perhaps talk about that in a moment or two, because it's not going to happen overnight. But fundamentally, from our point of view, there are a number of things which we need to do. We talk about fairness in the supply chain, and I know in the dairy breakout session you've already spoken about contracts and trying to make sure that there is fairness in that supply chain. Agriculture bill introduces first processor responsibilities and some legislation around that. It's taken on the legacy of the GSCOP. So we really want to go and expose that contractual relationship for dairy farmers, because it is quite clearly the ability for the dairy sector to be able to make the best of the great product that they've got, and making sure that the processors and producers are getting an honest, fair and transparent relationship where value is shared rather than falling in just one part of that. I think from my point of view, I'm interested in looking also at that link between productivity, and we talked about net zero. When we first started talking about that cornerstone of productivity under our Brexit cornerstones, I think there was a fair amount of scepticism sometimes from members, sometimes from the Treasury. Members going, if you're just going to produce more, we're going to produce lower prices. It's not about that. It's about producing more smartly, helping farmers to get a more production efficiency, getting a greater return from the market. From the Treasury and others on the economic wing of government, they're going, well, why are we going to pay farmers to become more profitable? Surely it's in your economic interest to do that and push that. So we're actually, the net zero gives an opportunity to talk about that, because actually production efficiency is great for greenhouse gas production. It reduces our methane, nitrous oxide emissions. It also is good in terms of the bottom line as well, being able to have smart applications, benchmarking, genetics, animal health, all those things help to deliver greenhouse gas reductions as well. So there is potential and opportunity where we can link back to production efficiency that actually is a public good rather than simply being a private good. So we're opening up in terms of that. I suppose the last thing I'd say is the work we're doing to encourage AHDB to actually delivering some of the goods, some of the services that you as dairy farmers and across the sectors need. So that's both in terms of restructuring, focusing on market development, but most significantly getting a really effective technology transfer from research, which we heard about yesterday afternoon, onto farm, and making that a much slicker and a much more efficient approach.
Thank you, Andrew. Lots of opportunities there. So we'll go to the balcony now, my left, just to be clear.
John Gatenby, North East, predominantly a livestock farmer. The prospect of no deal worries me considerably with the livestock sector, beef, sheep and pigs, because we eat quite a proportion of the carcass, but there are bits that are considered delicacies abroad, but not in demand in this country, called the fifth quarter. At the moment, that fifth quarter more than covers the cost of slaughter. We need that to continue to be an asset rather than a liability and a cost which is passed back to the producer.
Absolutely right, John. And as an industry, we produce something and then it's broken down. And those individual parts, those different cuts, go to many different countries. And that's a real challenge going forward. So we need to be able to access the right countries. You know, we're in the lamb industry, for instance, we're very leg-driven here in the UK, and there's serious carcass imbalance. So I think we've got to develop some new products, and we've got to really drive forward with those opportunities. We'll go to David next.
Hi, David Brooks, Staffordshire dairy farmer and council delegate. Obviously, we've been clearly bogged down with Brexit and the agricultural bill and the importance of those for every sector. But we need to be looking at the situation after March 29th. We need to be getting engaged as a union and as an industry with the industrial strategy, because there'll be no leader funding, there'll be no other funding. We've got to find avenues to actually get investment to improve productivity where productivity is needed. And the only way to deliver that is with the industrial strategy. And we're not, as a union, actually, in my opinion, engaged enough with that, and we need to be actually on the same page as other sectors are.
Okay, thank you for being brief, David. On to Andrew, industrial strategy. Keep it short, because I'm really keen to have as many questions as we can.
Well, I think, David, actually, the President might want to have a word with you a bit later, actually, because she is sitting on the industrial strategy sector board. And we're certainly helping to fund some of this. So, I've got a microphone. So yeah, look, we are working closely on agricultural productivity work stream in terms of industrial strategy. There are great opportunities there, and you're absolutely right, there is funding. Last year, Greg Clark stood at this very spot and talked about, effectively, extension. £90 million to actually take research out onto the farm and to promote that, and as a catalyst, as a catapult for that sort of technology transfer. So you're absolutely right, we do need to engage in terms of the industrial strategy. I believe we are, well, I know we are, and I think it is actually starting to get some benefits. As many things in government, it takes an awful long time to get some of the delivery that we'd like to see, though.
Okay, we'll take two questions now. We've got one right at the front, and then we've got the roving mic just behind.
Hello, my name's Callum Kendall from Nottinghamshire. I'm a first-generation farmer. Just really question, how do you think policy can sort of encourage younger people to get involved in the industry? We've had the Young Farmers sort of top-up scheme in the past, and that's not really had a lot of an impact, and that only really works if you're already from a farming family. So just a question about that, really.
Great to see you here. Profitability is the number one. Number two behind there.
The agricultural bill, it seems to have been put on the back burner a little bit. Some parts of it could be quite enabling going forward. Specifically, there's a clause in there about promoting domestic food production and the potential for an intervention type scheme to back up prices if there's a disaster at short notice. If that doesn't happen, obviously the agricultural bill is not going to happen before the 29th of March. Where are we with that bill? And if it's not implemented within 12 months, we're a bit stuck.
Okay, Nick first, Ag Bill, and then we'll go to Andrew. How do we ensure that we have the next generation keen to become part? Great to see you and many others of your counterparts here today. Welcome. So first of all, Andrew, Nick, Ag Bill.
As I said, the agriculture bill has sort of stalled. Which is not to say that it'll sort of re-emerge at some point, but there is a chance that it will stall for quite a long period of time, indeed until the end of the current session, and so won't re-emerge until the autumn. The specifics of your question about what happens if it isn't enacted by the end of March is that the process I mentioned earlier of transferring the entirety of the EU statute, but essentially into UK law, will mean that actually all the current CAP regulations and the operation of BPS and other related schemes will continue and be operational. And so the government will have the power to essentially continue as we are now post March 29th. And in fact, even in the agriculture bill, the government's intention is to maintain BPS this year, to run something which is pretty much looks like BPS next year, and for the transition to start in 2021, and that'll be a 7-year period where direct payments begin to get phased out and new schemes begin to come online. That may be delayed, it may not, but what it does mean is it's not critical that the agriculture bill is in law by the end of March, or even in the current parliamentary session. And actually, just worth saying, there are lots of bits in the Ag Bill which we think need improving. We'll continue to lobby pretty heavily on it, but the Ag Bill is only part of the story. That is essentially an enabling bill, allows government powers to continue to make support payments and do other related things we've touched on already for farming, but actually the really key bit will be how governments, the current government or future governments use the powers they've been given and how they wish to support agriculture in the future.
Very quickly, Andrew, around young farmers, active farmers.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. It's something which we've got to focus on, succession and entry, and getting the next generation involved. Not just in NFU, not just in the industry, but in the NFU as well. So I'm really pleased that we've got so many here at conference, but it's something work in progress. I think number one, farming has got to be a profitable, productive and successful place with somewhere people want to work. One of the reasons I'm doing this rather than actually farming is because when I came out, farming was in the doldrums and there was no opportunity at all. So I think we've got to have plenty of opportunity and success in terms of the industry. That's going to be absolutely critical. I think the BPS transition does potentially, as long as it's handled well, does have the opportunity, not maybe at the ownership end, but in terms of the rental end of the market, because the indications are that FBTs might become more affordable in the future, which might help in some entry. The other point I'd make is that farming, it's not just about, you enter farming not just by owning or renting land. There are lots of other opportunities, farm management, working with the NFU. There are plenty of other ways to get involved in the NFU and farming, and we need to make sure that all of those are available. So I did all of that package.
Really tight now, keep it tight because we're virtually out of time. The last 3 questions will go middle left, middle right, and then we'll go up to the balcony up the top. Ivor.
My question is quite simple, really. Why is a bad deal better than no deal?
Yes, Tom Allen Stevens, Oxfordshire farmer. My question is on gene-edited crops. The NFU is part of a cross-industry initiative to look at the impact of the European Court of Justice ruling on gene-edited crops that classes them as GMOs. There was a cross-industry round table that was hosted by the NFU last week where Michael Gove and Professor Ian Boyd were presented the case for it. My question, Andrew, is where do we go from here?
Okay, and upstairs.
Thank you, Chairman. Paul Brown, Staffordshire. Small group of farmers from my local branch met with a delegation from DEFRA last month who were sent up to visit a working farm. Two things, certainly common views in our branch were that future agriculture bill, can we please lobby as much as we can to draw money for investment in new infrastructure and improving infrastructure, because without that, we believe many of the new innovations we talk about just aren't going to work and aren't relevant. And another small topic on that meeting was discuss the possibility of effectively a golden handshake, where an outgoing farmer might be able to draw down several years of the outgoing BPS, but they couldn't explain what mechanism might be in place for a new entrant, a new incoming farmer onto that farm or onto that land, which could impede a young farmer or a new entrant taking on a farm.
Okay, right. We're nearly out of time, so we'll keep the answers brief and concise. First of all, Nick, no deal, bad deal.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard already this morning, and we heard from Michael Gove yesterday, what the implications of no deal are, and they are pretty bad. Of course, if you could come up with a really, really, really bad deal that's worse than that, then I think you'd have to ask the question which is worse. But the deal's on the table, and we've looked at this obviously closely, either what came out from Chequers, what is in the withdrawal agreement and the future declaration. I wouldn't describe any of those as being bad deals for farming. Now, it's from the NFU's point of view, that is what we're interested in. What the implications of the government's position, the deals on the table, mean for farm businesses and their future viability, and that's key. We're making an assessment on that basis alone. We have, very briefly, I mentioned, we have 6 principles agreed by our council which essentially guide us in making an assessment of whatever is on the table. They are to avoid no deal, to ensure a close trading relationship with the EU, to allow greater regulatory control post-Brexit, access to workers, both seasonal and permanent, ensuring our trade policy protects our standards, and ensuring we have a new agricultural policy that drives productive businesses. And at the moment, there is a deal. It is by no means perfect, to be absolutely clear, but it ticks more of those boxes, certainly, than no deal does.
Thank you, Nick. Andrew, gene editing in 30 seconds.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree with you, Tom. It's a critical issue. We talked about it yesterday. I think that the problem we've got is that we focus on the technology and not the benefits. We are never going to get net zero agriculture. We're not going to get profitable, productive, competitive businesses in the world context unless we have access to that type of novel technology in terms of breeding, not just probably plants, but animals as well. So what have we got to do? We've got to have a conversation with politicians which results in them actually having some leadership in terms of this subject. But also we've got to have a conversation with the public about the benefits that this type of technology brings to them. If it's just about, as it has been in the past, discussions about how much multinational companies get benefit from this type of thing, we're never going to get that approach. It's got to be about how it benefits things which are in the public interest.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. In terms of the question around infrastructure, yes, absolutely vital that all these policy levers are aligned. You know, we have a real ambition to be the best going forward in terms of UK agriculture. So it's absolutely vital that we do get the right investment onto the ground in that way. In terms of golden handshake, some concerns there obviously because we're about supporting the active farmer, the person taking the business risk. So there's a lot of detail we need to see around that, and that's rather unclear at the present time. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I know there are a number of people who want to ask more questions, but we are out of time. It's been a real pleasure to have you contribute to this part. I hope we've been able to answer some of the questions. It's a real pleasure to be part of the office holder team here at NFU. I think Manette did a fantastic job with our Secretary of State yesterday in opening the day. It really set the tone. Well done, Manette. It's a real pleasure to work with both Guy and Stuart and Aled, my deputy in NFU Cymru. It's all part of a team, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, it wouldn't be right for me to talk about teams and not talk about welcoming you down to Wales on Saturday. Of course, we are the underdogs. In Wales, we particularly like being the underdogs, so come on down. And it was particularly nice last night as well to have our grace said bilingually, and I was particularly pleased to hear over 1,000 people in the hall last night pray for a Welsh victory. So thank you very much for that. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, our Director General, Terry.
Well, good morning, conference. There's an old saying about a week being a long time in politics, but it would seem that about 50 minutes is for reasons which will become apparent shortly. Steve and I have been following social media and trying to listen to John Davis's session. The second part of this session today will allow us to take in the wider political scene. And to do that, I'm joined by Steve Richards. Steve is a political columnist and broadcaster. He regularly presents Radio 4's Week in Westminster and is the author of The Rise of the Outsiders, How Mainstream Politics Lost Its Way, a particularly apt title today, I think. And we're in for a real treat as we ask Steve to help us try and make sense of the politics around Brexit and more generally. Steve, welcome to conference.
Thank you very much.
We had quite a day yesterday, as you will have heard and seen.
Yes.
Michael Gove talked about the calamitous impacts of no deal. He's never lost for words, but he did struggle to answer questions on tariffs from farmers and from the media, standards, post-Brexit contingency funding, and then last but by no means least, he gave out the email of his private secretary to a farmer from Shropshire, but in doing so, inadvertently gave it to the whole farming community. And so
Make the most of it. I mean, you know.
So much so is the concern that Pray for Mike Rowe was trending on Twitter last night. Now, the general consensus was that the Secretary of State said very little. He made some encouraging noises in areas which concern members, but to be frank, he'd been sent into battle with very little by way of offensive weaponry. So we're, as I say, still trying to make sense of it all. And in doing so, it would be tempting to try and reflect on what might be described as the extraordinary events of the last 2.5 years, but there simply isn't the time. And I think what we'd perhaps better do is, so we don't give ourselves indigestion, is maybe reflect on the last 7 days, which, as we know, is a long time in politics. With the vote in the Commons on Thursday, that was the Prime Minister's 11th defeat in 14 months on Brexit. On Monday, 7 members of the Labour Party resigned. Yesterday, Honda announced that they were leaving Swindon. And ladies and gentlemen, while we've been sat here at about 11:05, 3 members of the Conservative Party resigned. Anna Soubry,
Heidi Allen, and Sarah Wollaston.
And Sarah Wollaston, the chair of the Health Select Committee. Now, normally, each of those events would kind of make the news and would dominate the news agenda for days at a time, but it's pretty congested at the moment. So, Steve, these are unprecedented times.
They are.
Can you try and help us make sense of it all?
I'll try and unpick some of that. Cancel lunch, because there's so much going on. It's unbelievable. In fact, before the news broke about these 3 Tory MPs, I joked outside with one of your colleagues that when you're doing live events at the moment, you have to check minutes before you go on stage in case anything has happened. And sure enough, something big has happened minutes before we went on stage. This does feel in some ways bigger, even though it's only 3 of them, than the Labour split the other day, because we've known really for 2 years that the Parliamentary Labour Party is at odds with its leadership. It tried to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn famously in 2016. So it wasn't a huge surprise when that split happened on Monday. For the Tory party, which is much better at holding together in times of crisis, this feels quite significant for 2 reasons. These 3 are going for one reason alone: Brexit. The Labour MPs, it's for a range of things, partly Brexit. The second thing is this, and this is kind of instant analysis I've only just heard, is that in a hung parliament, to lose 3 MPs going to the other side and potentially voting against you becomes more significant too. And I've just thought of a third reason. I'm doing a Radio 4 series at the moment, it's going out next month, called Theresa May's Brexit Journey. And it's clear to me, and I know you and others have spoken to it, that part of her calculation all the way along is that she must keep the Conservative Party together. It's not her only calculation. On Brexit, there are about 10,000 whirling through that inscrutable mind. But that was one of them. And today it failed because 3 have left. So it feels Westminster has been febrile for 2 years now. We are entering the most extraordinary phase probably of our lives in British politics. That clock ticks towards the end of March. I am pretty sure that Theresa May doesn't want no deal. You all know clearly that Michael Gove, who's a Brexiteer, doesn't want no deal. But these are nerve-wracking days. It's clear to me also that Theresa May, who is regarded often as a cautious politician, is making quite a big gamble. She is dogged. She basically wants to cling to her deal, even though it got famously defeated in one of those defeats by 200 plus votes. And she has calculated, I think, that the threat of no deal might get her the movement she needs from the European Union, and the threat of no deal will persuade some Labour MPs in the end to vote for her deal in some form. So I think those are some of the calculations. Just finally in this preliminary, and then please ask me about any element of it. As part of this Radio 4 series, I spoke to 2 cabinet ministers off the record yesterday. One, very senior, said they thought that she would get enough from the EU over the next few days, that in the end, the EU will want a deal more than wholly supporting the Irish position at the moment, and she will come back with enough to get her deal through the House of Commons with only a relatively small number of Tories rebelling. I spoke to another cabinet minister who said the exact opposite, that she, just with equal, conviction, which is this, that she won't get much from Europe, certainly not enough to please Jacob Rees-Mogg and that wing of her parliamentary party, and that therefore, the only way a deal surfaces is through reaching out to Labour and the Customs Union proposition, which would get a majority through in the House of Commons, because there's always been a majority for a soft Brexit, which includes a customs union. Now, it's unbelievable that we don't, as the first panel suggested, that there are still these options there, but they are. And even Theresa May, I don't think, knows for sure quite what's going to happen next.
No. I want to ask you a little bit, we know about these three guys resigning, and I want to ask you about Parliament's role in all of this, and in the scenario that you paint where the Prime Minister really tries to plough on and stick to her guns, and she's been pretty resilient in that regard. There's been quite a lot of talk about Parliament taking control since Christmas, and with respect, it's been commentators, talking heads, and dare I say, the usual suspects in the House. But last week, which seems like an eternity ago, respected former Minister Oliver Letwin concluded a speech in the House by saying that there would need to be a fundamental realignment of government, Parliament, and the civil service, and that the Commons must take on the government of our country and be a cabinet itself. And I suppose I'm interested in how this morning's news might impact that. But also, just when someone like that reaches that conclusion, and we know that he's not on his own, are we now moving from the theoretical to the practical in terms of Parliament taking control?
Well, as the other panel said, next week will be the crucial test in that respect. Parliament, Theresa May's view, from my understanding, speaking in number 10 to people, is extraordinary, really. I mean, she believes that she has this duty to deliver the referendum, and that referendum counts more in a way than what Parliament's doing at any given time. And therefore, she just ploughs on, if she gets defeated. I mean, she is unique amongst British prime ministers, and you can admire it or be frustrated by it. But for example, if Blair, Cameron or Gordon Brown had lost the most important vote since 1945 by over 200, one way or another, they'd have gone crazy. Blair would have gone back and said to Alice Cameron, right, this is a disaster. How do we present this as a triumph? Gordon Brown would have said, get me Peter, get me Peter, get me Peter. What do I do? What do I do? I've just lost everything. And David Cameron would say, well, George, how do we sort this out? We've got to do it. They'd all be in a state of frenzy and panic. She went back to number 10, having lost this vote, and began the negotiations again with the other groups within her party, the DUP, almost as if nothing had happened. And when there was a vote of confidence against her, I interviewed Graham Brady yesterday, the chair of the 1922 committee, for this series I'm doing, and he had to phone her. She was knackered. She'd been in Europe all day, and he had to phone her that evening to say the number of signatures are in. There's going to be a vote of confidence against your leadership. And apparently she just calmly said, okay, so how do we organize this? What's the procedure? As if she was kind of discussing a shopping list, and indeed someone else's shopping list. And so she just presses on. But she is a leader in a hung parliament with a divided party. So Parliament could take control at any moment. And the key tests next week, there will be two, actually. There will be, as the panel discussed, the Yvette Cooper, Nick Bowles amendment, which, if passed, I think will be quite reassuring for some in this audience because it makes no deal less likely, and an extension to Article 50, which, by the way, I think is inevitable. There is just not enough time, even if her deal passes, to get all the legislation sorted out here. And of course, it has to be ratified in the European Parliament and in some other parliaments. So the big test for Parliament is next week. And I think the formation of these independent MPs is quite significant because it gives those who want either a softer Brexit or a delay to Article 50, or for sure her to come out against no deal, with quite an additional piece of ammunition. Because her colleagues, and remember how committed she is to the Conservative Party, can now say to her, we're talking about the Remainers as were, not the Jacob Rees-Moggs, they can say to her, unless you rule out no deal, and some of them will be saying this in the coming days, we too will resign and become an independent. And so the dynamic is changing hourly. But if I were to measure it at all, and I know a lot of people in the audience are worried about no deal, the events of the last few days make no deal slightly less likely, because they now have somewhere to go, those in her party who are terrified of no deal.
So just pick on the arithmetic for a second. So 7 are already 8.
Yeah.
And we've got 3 Conservatives that have resigned this morning. So can you see either of those numbers, that scenario that you've just painted, where they don't get cooperation from number 10, can you see more defections to that independent group?
I think there will be more defections on both sides in the coming weeks. As I say, on the Labour side, it's not invisible. We've known for 2 years most Labour MPs do not support the Corbyn leadership. So there will be more from their side. Theresa May has got this nightmarish balancing act. If she doesn't deliver Brexit by March the 29th in a form where the backstop issue is addressed as well as other things, all hell will break loose on the Jacob Rees-Mogg wing. But if she moves or is seen to be moving towards no deal, I think a lot of her soft Brexiteers will threaten to go, and some will. Not that many, but some will.
So the independent group's got a kind of temporary feel to it at the moment. You look at its branding, I mean, it's pretty basic stuff. But as time goes by, this will start to consolidate, and more and more people coalesce maybe around this group. In the long term, what happens to it? Is it merely temporary? Is it a marriage of convenience, or does it turn into something a little bit more long-term?
By the end of this year, they'll have set up a new political party.
Okay.
And they'll have to have an election for leader, and there will be a new political party. Now, in the long term, the chances of this political party being a success is very limited. I mean, I'm old enough, none of you will remember, you're far too young, but I can only just remember the SDP.
It's only 1981.
No, yeah. Well, I was about 3 at the time. And there was an even greater excitement around the SDP because the figures were much bigger. Roy Jenkins, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Home Secretary, David Owen, a former Foreign Secretary. I mean, they made this lot look pathetic in their charisma and glamour and ministerial experience. And they lasted about 7 or 8 years, and collapsed completely. But all I know for sure is that in the short term, this will deeply destabilize both leaderships. Leaders fear more than anything else defections, because it gives the impression of a party unhappy with itself and lacking momentum. That's why Cameron called that referendum. He called it because he feared, Craig Oliver, his press secretary, told me, Cameron thought 15 Tory MPs were about to defect to UKIP, and that the only thing that would stop them from defecting was the offer of a referendum. That's why he called it. And that he thought he was going to win. Fairly fundamental misjudgment. So Theresa May will now have even more cause for sleepless nights, worried that others might go. And Corbyn, who, to put it politely, is one of the more laid-back leaders in British politics, happier in some ways at his allotment than dealing with internal Labour Party problems. But he too will be worried by this because a party that is splitting cannot win an election. So in the short term, whatever the longer term prospects of this party, in the short term, it will impact on the dynamics of this Brexit debate, and it will really alarm Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn.
Look, I know you were only 3 years old at the time.
Yeah.
But if you were to reflect, the gang of 11 as they are now, what lessons could they learn from the gang of 4? I mean, it's a party, the history of that experiment has been massively poured over by lots of people, including yourself. So are there any lessons that that group can learn from the gang of 4 from the early 80s?
I think in a way what is needed very early on is absolute clarity of purpose. Because the Gang of 4, although these huge figures, they all knew what they were against. They were against the Labour Party at the time. But there were big disagreements about what they were for. So Roy Jenkins was very close to the then Liberal leader David Steele. Absolutely marvellous. David is a wonderful figure. And David Owen couldn't bear the Liberals. He was like, we're way above those sandal-wearing, beard-growing kind of vegetarians. And so from the very beginning, there was confusion about what they were for, and the seeds I can now see of their fall were sown at the beginning. Now, this might happen with this new party, because they know what they're against. They're against, if you're the 3 Tories, the drift of their Tory party, and on the other side, the Labour ones are against the Corbyn leadership. They need to very quickly agree what they're for, or else they'll start falling out. And for a new party to start falling out is literally fatal. They won't last very long.
Okay. So can we just talk about Labour then? So, I mean, looking certainly at the start of the week, I was thinking that this could end in one of 2 ways. Either, when it comes to Brexit, either Corbyn bends towards a softer Brexit or a people's vote to avoid further defections, or maybe he thinks that no one else will have the balls, and so he hardens his position. What's Labour's next move now on Brexit?
I think Corbyn, again, as far as he can get into agony about something, is in agony over this. Corbyn doesn't want another referendum, and a lot of his party want another referendum. And it's obvious why Corbyn doesn't want another referendum. He's not that enthusiastic about remaining. I was at a meeting during the 2016 referendum, which I'll never forget. It was a Labour for Europe rally. And Alan Johnson, the former minister, the postman, came on. He was in charge of Labour for Europe. It was in a hall like this. And he said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Welcome to Labour for Europe. We are the only party passionately and united in favour of staying in the European Union. And here to explain why is our leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And Corbyn walked onto the stage, and basically this is a summary of what he said. Comrades, first of all, I want to say this. In the battle between the European Union and Greece, we are with Greece. It is a disgrace that the European Union is imposing its policies on an elected radical left government in Greece. 2, if the European Union tries to stop the next Labour government from nationalising the railways, we will defy those corporatist dictators from Brussels and go ahead with the nationalisation of the railways. Then he paused and said, Labour's position is to remain. Thank you very much. And he walked on. And then Alan Johnson walked back on, and he had aged about 150 years. He looked terrible. And he just said, thank you very much, Jeremy. And then he said, so now you all know why Labour are so passionately in favour of the European Union. And he walked on. And Corbyn doesn't want to relive this again. But there is, as well as the Cooper-Bowles amendment next week on Wednesday, there's this proposition put forward by a Labour MP, Peter Kyle, for a referendum on May's deal. And he's been quite cunning on this, because he has said, if this is backed, even though he opposes May's deal, he will vote for May's deal, but there then has to be a referendum on it. And Corbyn is under huge pressure to back this amendment. And I think John McDonnell has now decided that they should. And there will be threats from some Labour MPs, like Peter Kyle, to leave and join these independents if he doesn't. So while Theresa May has got much the biggest calls to make in the next few weeks, she's got the biggest calls of any Prime Minister since 1945 in the next few weeks. Not least if she decides to go for no deal at the very end of all of this, which I don't think she will, probably. But God, probably. But time is running out. But Corbyn has got quite a few calls to make, so it's worth watching out what Labour's leadership does on that referendum amendment, because if it were to back it, there are quite a few Conservative MPs, including those 3 independents, who would probably back it too.
I want to come on to the government's attitude to business to finish up, and then maybe touch briefly on its impact on where farming is. But I want to first of all look across the English Channel, and it's very easy to focus on what's happening in Westminster, but if there are our negotiating partners in the EU27 to consider. I know you were in Europe last week. Andrew and the team were out there as well. I just wondered what you're hearing out there, and particularly, I mean, how Barnier and others are reacting to what they must consider to be an impasse in the UK Parliament.
Yeah. Well, the impression I got, I'd be interested to know what your team found, lends me to think more towards the Cabinet Minister who said to me she wouldn't get such a great deal on the backstop to reassure Jacob Rees-Mogg and co. And that's for 2 reasons. The impression I get is that they no longer trust her ability to command Parliament, with quite good cause when you think about it. I mean, defeated 14 times. So they are reluctant to make moves which they don't really want to do, and then find it will just get defeated again. So her authority with them, I think, is greatly diminished. I also sense that in the end, the backstop can't really be finessed, because it's a contradiction in terms to have an insurance policy where you leave unilaterally or whatever. So there's clearly going to be wording which will strengthen the legality of Britain's right to leave at some point and its temporary nature. But I suspect that won't be enough to please the ERG and Rees-Mogg and so on. But they want a deal. I'm absolutely clear the EU want a deal and will go the extra yard or metre to make sure that a deal is secured. They want the money. They don't want the disruption that it will cause for their industries and sectors. So the gloomy side is I think she won't get as much as she needs to convince the hardliners, but let's wait and see. But they want a deal. And I think they will give us an extension time-wise to avoid a no deal.
Even if there's not a clear plan on our side?
Good question. There has to be some clarity about what happens with the extra time.
Okay. So look, on to business. There's what I could best describe as, I suppose, incredulity amongst business groups. I'm thinking more broadly than farming now when it comes to no deal. There's a real sense that government stopped listening, at least temporarily, while the PM's running the clock down. You would speak to lots of business people and lots of sectors and trade bodies. So, what's the mood out there? And is government really deaf to the needs of business at this time, or is it all sort of put on, if you like?
No, well, it is really, I think that phrase running down the clock is what she's doing, I'm afraid. I mean, I think as I think I said earlier, her strategic judgment, as she's not really a strategist, Theresa May. She kind of moves from day to day, and she kind of thinks very in linear terms. So this should happen and this will happen. But as far as she thinks ahead, it is to put that juxtaposition to the Commons, her deal or no deal. And in the interim, I'm afraid the concerns of the farming sector, the car sector and others can just go hang. And, you know, and the other interesting thing I find about the Conservative Party, which was always when I was growing up, you know, 10 years ago, it was always the party of business. And there is a section of it which have become so, we remember the famous phrase of Boris Johnson.
Well, yeah.
We can't repeat it
No,
here,
we can't
can
really.
we?
No, there's children watching.
F business.
Yeah.
There is a section that have become so theological about Europe that they aren't interested. But as you know, that isn't the case with May herself, basically. She's a pragmatist. She has just been overwhelmed by this Brexit challenge. You know, she's a decent person, but she's not a big political figure, and she's been overwhelmed by it. And you know, she would say, if she was sitting here, she was pro-business. Michael Gove, as you know, has become, in a way, more evangelical against a no deal, having had discussions with the likes of you. I mean, he's become more aware of what will happen. Greg Clark, who's anyway a Remainer, really deep down, is desperate. Someone was asking about the industrial strategy, is desperate to get that going and centre stage. But he knows, while no deal hovers over your sector and other businesses, you can't really do anything. And not only that, you can't plan for anything because you don't know what deal will take place if there is one. And so it's a nightmare for businesses, and it's ironic, I think, that the party that would have regarded themselves, it was one of their slogans, we are the party of business, have got businesses. Everyone I meet shares the impression I got during the panel discussion from this room. The greatest alarm and worry is just the uncertainty of not being able to plan. And it is staggering. I mean, we met at a dinner a couple of months ago in November, I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah. And I started by saying, I can't quite believe we're sitting here not knowing what form Brexit is going to take. I really can't believe we're sitting here in February, still unsure. So there's a kind of May and others, you know, Tory pragmatists who, in theory, would say, yeah, they are absolutely committed to business and farming, but Brexit has just overwhelmed them.
Okay. So look, I mean, you've got a different perspective to most of the people in this room. Can I just ask how you think farming might have been viewed in this debate and how that might have changed over time? And I suppose also any advice you've got for the farmers in this room today. I mean, they're a politically active bunch. They're great at talking to their members of parliament and making the case for farming. I mean, yeah. Is there any point in continuing to do that?
Massively, massively. I hear let's talk about the governing party, because that's where power lies for the time being. And by the way, for some time, I'd be surprised if there's a general election amidst all the other things. And I hear one thing that will alarm you from the really theological hardline Brexiteers. I've heard it said, and you might have experienced this, when it has been put to some of the hardliners that with no deal or some variations of some deals, the two sectors that will be really hit hard are farming and the car industry. Yeah. And I've heard it said from some of the hardliners, so what? You know, we now, the future for Britain is the service industries, high tech. Yeah. You know, farming doesn't matter, we'll flourish in this new age, and the trade deals will be much more in that area, and so on. But then I hear the other, which is why you've got to carry on engaging and putting the case that your sector, and indeed the car sector, which is the other one, which could be very vulnerable, supply chains and all the rest of it with a no deal, are absolutely fundamental to the future of the UK. And in a way become more fundamental in some Brexit scenarios where food from the European Union, say, becomes much more expensive to import, and so on. Now, you obviously have got to export as well, but I mean, that puts you absolutely at the centre of things. So I would really, I think you need to engage. I mean, you do a brilliant job, and the film showed the degree to which the brilliance it manifests itself. But because of that hardline theology of, oh, sod, you know, the farming sector, because we're moving, we're going to become something else, you know, it's in a way even more important. Have you picked that up from some hardliners?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the $64,000 question is, which is the bigger group? Our sense is there's a growing, over the last 2.5 years, there's been a growing group of people that believe the latter, that this is an important industry, that is that does create the building blocks for the UK's largest manufacturing sector, and it's worth protecting and looking after.
Yeah, it's by far the bigger group. I mean, just look at the parliamentary numbers. You know, the ERG, the hardline group, there are about 50 of them, but some of them are much more pragmatic than others. So there are only a few, and they wouldn't, I think, mount the case publicly very confidently, who have this vision of an entirely different UK in which manufacturing and farming become redundant and almost... So no, it's a small proportion. But what you've got to remember is that the membership, although absolutely, if you ask them, would be committed to the farming sector and the car industry, they are quite hardline on Brexit.
Conservative Party members.
Sorry, the Conservative Party membership. So they could elect one of these ideologues. And that would be quite a precarious moment, I think, for some businesses and the farming sector. So there's huge amounts to play for.
And when will we have a change of leader of that party, do you think?
Of the Conservative Party? Well, the two things, just very briefly, because I'm sure...
Yeah, we're nearly there.
Oh, sorry, one, I think Theresa May, you know, people say, you know, I feel a bit sorry for her. I wouldn't. I think she's quite enjoying it in a sort of perverse way. She's wanted to be Prime Minister since her early 20s. And it is her life, and I think she wants to carry on for as long as possible. But when I did this interview with Graham Brady yesterday from the 1922 committee, he did say that her pledge, which she made on the day of that vote of no confidence, at the private meeting of Conservative MPs, not to fight the next election as leader, was, this is Brady talking on the record, was crucial in enabling her to win that vote of confidence. So even though I think she would like to carry on for some time, I suspect towards the end of this year, they've got to wait a year before they can challenge her, but I don't think she'll wait, you know. I think within a year, there will probably be another leader of the Conservative Party. The only way that doesn't happen is if she does call a snap election. But I just can't see that happening. When Labour split on Monday, there were some Tory MPs saying, maybe we should have an election with a split Labour Party, let's do it. But now they're split. You know, so I don't think that's going to happen.
Right, it's very dangerous to conclude interviews with quickfire questions for both the interviewee and the interviewer, it seems.
More the interviewee, I think.
Yeah, after last...
The Churchill.
Yeah, I certainly won't ask you about heroes or villains. But what next for Michael Gove?
You want that in a few seconds?
Yeah.
He could, in certain circumstances, be in with quite a decent chance of the leadership as a relatively pragmatic Brexiteer. It kind of depends what happens over the next few weeks. I don't think he wants it that much, but I suspect his wife does. And that may play quite a big part in his calculations.
Okay, great. Which is the PM putting first? Country, business, economy, or party?
Well, let me answer that as a politician's answer. She has conflated her survival, the unity of her party, with the national interest, I think. She would argue that what she's doing in trying to find a way through that keeps her party together, although she's lost 3 about an hour ago, is in the national interest too. I'm 100% sure she thinks what she's doing is in the national interest. But all prime ministers reach that point. You know, I remember Blair saying, well, I should resign, but I think in the national interest, I better carry on for another 10 years. You know, so they all convince themselves that what they're doing is in the national interest. Yeah. If we leave with no deal, she'll know she's failed, I think.
And will we leave on the 29th of March?
I don't think so. I just don't think there's enough time. I think there will be an extension.
Steve, thank you. Look, it's great to get an insider's take when, to be frank, we're not getting an awful lot from ministers.
No, they're really cautious.
We really struggled to get anyone from Westminster here today. And you touched on this, when we were planning this conference, we never thought that so much would be up in the air at this time and yet to be decided. But despite the limited information to hand, you've really helped us to make sense of it all. Now, I know many of you will listen to and highly recommend Steve's occasional behind-the-scenes look at UK politics based on his live one-man show, Rock and Roll Politics. And just to conclude on a personal note, over 10 years ago, you interviewed a very young NFU staffer that was parachuted in at the last minute into a recording of GMTV Sunday, I think probably to talk about British summertime and farmers working hard in the fields, and through a very odd set of circumstances, we actually ended up talking about Big Brother and the and somebody called Jade Goody. Remember her?
Yeah.
So it's great to return the favour. So Steve, thank you for your time today and your insights, ladies and gentlemen. Please put your hands together for Steve Richards.
Thank you all for listening. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Wait way off there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one of the best bits about working for the NFU is working with its members, and what makes this organisation a very special one is that as professional staff, we get to work with enthusiastic, well-briefed members day in, day out. Obviously, the NFU member that I have the great privilege to work most closely with is your president, a great champion, an effective campaigner, and a successful convener. Ladies and gentlemen, to the stage, your president, Minette Batters.
Conference, I'm well aware that I am standing between you and your lunch, and that's never a good place to be. So look, I'm not going to be long. I think it's been a fascinating insight. Steve, I said to so many people on the way in, if you want to know what's going on, listen to this man. We know a lot more, but we still don't know what's going to happen, do we? Brilliant, though. Thank you. Look, I can't tell you how much I take the responsibility of this role very close to my heart. We are in an extraordinary time, and the role of the NFU has never been more important. And that's on many, many different levels. The warm words yesterday from Michael Gove, I have to say, in all honesty, I was horrified when I read his speech the night before. It's nice to have one sentence saying that I'm a good person to work with. In every paragraph, it was just too many warm words. So look, for me, this whole standards piece, what we're asking for with the Commission to report by the end of the year, this has been front and centre of the entire Brexit conversations we've been having with government, because I do think it is the key. I would go as far as saying it is even more important, probably far more important than the future budget, which is incredibly important too. But if we don't get this standards piece right, I think that sets our industry back in a way that we've not seen before. So getting his commitment yesterday and trying to make it very clear, this is not about warm words. You know, we will not be judged on our great speeches, on our sound bites. We will be judged on what we deliver. And I ultimately will be judged on what I deliver. And I take that role very, very seriously. And I know I speak for the entire office holder team, for Guy, Stuart, and John Davis and Aled in Wales. But it's also, Brexit takes up so much time, our planning for the future. I mean, I've done 18 bilaterals with Nick and the Brexit team. So building the relationships across Europe, making sure that the farming unions across Europe are lobbying their governments to make sure we get a deal. It's been an extraordinarily frenetic time, but we can't just focus on Brexit. We have the day job. to do, and I'm absolutely delighted that the NFU has not taken one single person off the day job. The day job for all of you, our members, is as relevant as it's ever been. But then we come on to a whole new policy, to looking to the future, and we can't stand still. I don't want to be a president of the NFU that reacts to future changes. I want to be shaping the future. I want to be owning that plan. So I was delighted that we were able to host the first Environment Conference on the 11th of December 2018 and publish our first environment report, wanting to take back control of the environment for our farmers. Michael Gove is committed to a food strategy, something that I know I have been saying to all of you we need. I've been saying that for the last 6 years. I don't want to wait and react. So I think it's been a really important piece of work for us to bring a food strategy together. It has 4 fundamental pillars, one being the moral imperative of producing food, the second one being integrity and standards, the third one being health and nutrition, and the fourth and final one being agriculture's relationship with nature and tackling climate change. That work stream is well underway, working with the wider industry, working with stakeholders, working with the supply chain. So when we come through this, whatever that deal, whatever we end up with after the 29th of March, we're working very closely with Henry Dimbleby right now. It is in place. It is ready to go, rather than saying to Michael Gove, well, we actually, if we were going to do it, we wouldn't have done it like that. Owning the plan for the future, I think, is a hugely important part of what we do. But I just want to finish, really, by thanking our members of staff. Right across, we have 200 people in headquarters, 200 people who every single day are working on all of our behalf, trying to create a better environment for us to farm in. But our Brussels office has been in the most extraordinary place at this time, fielding questions from member states, having all of us going out there. I go out there once every 2 months. Our London office, we've now got a much bigger London office. It's really allowing many more staff to work in London from headquarters. Seismic change that has had to be driven. Our regions, the lifeblood of the NFU, our regions dealing with you on a daily basis. And our group secretaries as well. A massive thank you to all of you. You're going the extra mile for our members, and we really, really appreciate it. I guess the take-home message from me is I go to conferences. I went to conferences to get inspired, to go back to my farm and feel like I could conquer the world. I want you to go back to your farms and feel reinvigorated. I know there are challenges out there. But we have one of the most prized markets on the planet. And sometimes you need other people to tell you that. And when I meet with the Argentinians and the Canadians and the Australians and the New Zealanders, the many, many people who see the UK market as what they call a prized market. The US said the other day, the untapped potential of the UK food market. It's our market. And I want to make sure you remain the #1 suppliers to that UK market. We've been, as a union, we've been in consistent growth. We represent 47,000 farming businesses. For us as a team, we are constantly striving to grow the membership bigger, to grow our representative power. I want each and every one of you to be our activists on the ground. The role of our union going forwards is so crucially important. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to thank you so much for coming. Jack Bobo, I think, summed it up. He said we're going to see more change across the world in food production in the next 30 years than we've seen before, and I think he's right. And I think the UK is better placed than most to embrace those opportunities. Thank you very much. It's been a great conference, and have a safe trip home, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.